man tries to enter his own home, but someone blocks his way, accusing him of being where he doesn't belong. What happens next? It's a shocking series of events that you won't believe. This story will challenge assumptions, reveal uncomfortable truths, and prove why the truth always wins in the end. Stay with us. You'll want to see how this ends. Jamal Carter had always been a man who carried himself with quiet confidence. At 32, he had spent years building a career as a software engineer, a path that demanded patience, focus, and calm. He had recently relocated to this bustling city for work, leaving behind the familiarity of his hometown in search of new beginnings. Just 2 weeks ago, he moved into his apartment, a modern mid-rise building filled with well-off professionals and families. For Jamal, this was supposed to be a fresh start, new city, new surroundings. Yet in those 2 weeks he had already noticed the subtle looks, the small pauses when some neighbors crossed his path. He brushed it off, telling himself it was just unfamiliar faces, nothing more. Tonight, after another long day, he only wanted to head home, drop his bag and rest. But not everyone viewed him so simply. Linda Thornton had lived in the building for nearly a decade. To most, she was Linda with the little dog, the woman whose presence was as familiar as the mailboxes in the lobby. Mid-40s, well-kept and known for her sharp opinions, Linda carried herself like someone who felt she belonged. She had lived here longer than most, after all, and she acted like it. Her apartment was pristine, every surface spotless, her belongings neatly arranged. Linda thrived on order and predictability, yet over time, she had developed a reputation among residents. Neighbors whispered about her confrontations, her overbearing need to question strangers, her constant watchfulness. Some dismissed it as harmless, others avoided her entirely. To Linda, however, none of this was out of line. She saw herself as the building's unofficial overseer, always watching, always questioning, always alert. In her mind, this was her home to protect, and no detail would slip past her. There was also Mrs. Robinson, the elderly woman on the second floor. For years she had lived quietly in her apartment, her life moving at a slower pace. A widow in her late 70s, she had earned her place in the building's routine. Each day, she spent hours sitting in her favorite chair by the window, observing life outside, watching cars pull in, residents come and go, patterns unfolding with predictable rhythm. Unlike Linda, Mrs. Robinson watched with no judgment. She noticed things but rarely spoke of them. To her, people were people, each carrying stories she didn't need to know but understood existed. Over the years, she had seen more than anyone, realized. It was from this very window that she often caught glimpses of Linda's behavior, the whispered arguments, the people questioned at the lobby door, the complaints to building management. Mrs. Robinson didn't say much about it, but deep down she understood one thing. Linda had become something of a fixture, one that some wished would change. And then there was Jamal, new, unassuming, and perhaps to Linda, unfamiliar. That night, as he approached the entrance, his only concern was getting home. To Linda, however, he was someone she didn't recognize, someone she decided she needed to confront. The evening had begun like any other, quiet and ordinary, the kind of night where nothing should go wrong. Jamal Carter stepped toward the building's entrance, his shoulders weighed by the exhaustion of a long day. His key fob dangled loosely in his hand, swinging slightly as he approached the glass door. Just as he raised the fob to the scanner, footsteps sounded behind him. The soft jingle of a dog's collar followed closely, breaking the silence. It wasn't alarming, not at first. But Jamal felt it, the kind of gaze that lingers longer than it should. Linda Thornton had arrived. Puffy, her small dog, trotted beside her, pulling against the taut leash. Linda slowed her pace, her eyes narrowing slightly as she took in the man standing at the door. Something flickered behind her expression, a shift so subtle that most wouldn't notice it. Jamal, still unaware of her growing presence, pressed the fob to the panel. A soft beep followed by the green light. The lock clicked open. Before he could step inside, the voice came. "Excuse me." Jamal paused mid-step. It wasn't the word itself, it was how it was spoken. Cold, sharpened with suspicion. He turned to see her standing a few feet away, her posture stiff, her grip on the leash tighter than necessary. Linda's expression remained unreadable. Her small dog squirmed impatiently at her side. "Do you live here?" Jamal blinked, caught off guard. The question hit with an edge it shouldn't have carried. He replied politely, his voice steady, not confrontational. "Yes, ma'am, I'm on the 3rd floor." That should have been enough. The evening should have ended right there. But it didn't. Linda didn't move. Her feet remained planted, her eyes fixed on him, scanning, measuring him, as if the truth could be found in the way he stood or the tone of his voice. The seconds stretched longer than they should have. Jamal shifted slightly, uncomfortable now. "I live here," he said again, more firmly this time, his hand still holding the door open. Linda took a step closer. Her face hardened, suspicion etched deeper into her features. She reached out, grabbing the door handle with her free hand and holding it firmly open. "I don't think I've seen you before," she said slowly, her voice louder than before. "Who are you visiting?" The tall woman shook. Jamal's shoulders tensed. There was something deliberate in her tone now, a challenge disguised as concern. His patience, though not yet worn, thinned slightly. "I'm not visiting anyone," he replied, his voice calm but sharper now. "I live here. I've told you that already." Linda's eyes didn't waver. If anything, her grip on the door tightened, and her dog barked once, its small voice piercing through the still air. She shook the leash gently to quiet it, though her focus never left Jamal. "Let me see your key fob," she demanded suddenly, her voice firm. "Or your ID." The words hit like a slap, unexpected and bold. Jamal frowned, his face a mix of disbelief and frustration. He exhaled slowly, forcing himself to remain composed. "I don't need to show you anything," he said, his voice low. "I live here, just like you. Now, please, step aside." The moment teetered on the edge of something worse. Linda didn't move. Her expression darkened further. "This is my building," she said, her voice now louder, sharp enough to carry beyond them. "I know everyone who lives here. Why haven't I seen you before? I've been here for 10 years. Jamal's jaw tightened. Her words echoed with entitlement, with the assumption that her knowledge of the building, her ownership of it, could define who did or didn't belong. "Ma'am," Jamal said carefully, his voice steady but firm, "I've lived here for 2 weeks. I don't know what you're trying to do, but this is unnecessary. I've got nothing to prove to you." Linda stepped closer, her body now partially blocking the entrance. Her eyes narrowed further, her dog now quiet at her feet. "If you live here, you wouldn't mind showing me some proof, would you? It's simple. You either have a key fob or you don't." Jamal's patience began to fray. He didn't move to show her anything. He didn't owe her an explanation. "No," he said, his voice louder now. "I don't need to prove anything to you. Move aside." At that moment, someone else appeared, another resident. A man in his early 50s emerged from the parking lot and headed toward the door, his expression shifting as he saw the scene unfolding. For a moment, Jamal felt a flicker of hope. The man glanced at Linda, then at Jamal. He looked uncomfortable, hesitant, but said nothing. Instead, he walked past, slipping through the door with a mumbled, "Excuse me," and hurried steps. He didn't stop. He didn't help. He reached for the security door handle, but he'd been trained for this moment, pushing a door open before he'd even properly processed what he saw. Jamal watched him go, the silence heavier now. Linda, emboldened by the man's absence of action, stood even straighter, her grip on the door unrelenting. "This doesn't have to be difficult," she said, her voice calm again, though the edge remained. "If you live here, you should be able to prove it. I'm just looking out for the building." Jamal stared at her, his frustration now etched plainly across his face. He couldn't believe this was happening. The evening had started so simply, yet here he was, at his own front door, being treated like a trespasser. For a second, the silence seemed to stretch, taut and heavy. Then Jamal moved. Not aggressively, not forcefully. Just enough to step forward and reclaim what was already his. "Excuse me," he said, his voice calm but clipped. Linda shifted, her body jerked to the left, her arms extending slightly, like a physical barrier. Puffy, the small dog, barked once in irritation, tugging on the leash. Linda ignored it. "Stop," she said, the word cutting through the night air. "You're acting suspicious. I have every right to protect my building." Jamal's patience, worn thin, cracked just slightly. He stopped mid-step, meeting her gaze fully now. "Suspicious?" he repeated slowly. The word hung between them, carrying a weight neither wanted to address. "I live here. What part of that sounds suspicious to you?" Linda's face hardened, but her response was immediate. "I don't know you. I've never seen you before. That's suspicious enough." Jamal stared at her, disbelieving. His voice steadied itself, though his anger simmered beneath the surface. "You're stopping me because I'm black, aren't you?" The accusation landed hard. For a brief moment Linda flinched, as though the words had struck her directly. Her jaw tightened, and her hands gripped the leash even harder, her knuckles pale against the strain. "That's ridiculous," she shot back quickly. "This has nothing to do with that." Her voice climbed higher, a tremor of defensiveness breaking through. "You're the one refusing to show proof. Who does that? You're the one making this difficult." Jamal exhaled sharply, his frustration no longer subtle. "You're blocking me from my own building because you don't like how I look. That's the truth, isn't it?" Linda didn't answer. Instead, she pulled her phone out of her coat pocket, the glow of the screen illuminating her face. "That's it, I'm calling the police," she announced, her voice shrill now, vibrating with self-righteous certainty. Jamal's heart sank, but his resolve hardened. This wasn't the first time he had seen a situation like this, but he never imagined he'd find himself in one. He reached for his phone, his movements slow and deliberate. "If you're calling the police," Jamal said evenly, "then I'm recording this. This is harassment, and everyone's going to see it." The screen lit up in his hand as he opened the camera. The red light of the recording button appeared. A small signal that the truth would have to speak for itself. The silence seemed louder now, filled with unspoken anger, fear, and tension that only deepened with every passing second. Linda noticed the phone in Jamal's hand, and her face turned crimson. "Why are you recording me?" she snapped, taking a small step back but not enough to move out of his way. "I didn't do anything wrong. You're the one acting aggressive." Jamal pointed the camera directly at her, his voice, steady but strained, cut through her protests. "I'm recording this because people like you lie," he said bluntly, "and no one would believe me otherwise." Linda's face twisted in a mix of anger and disbelief. Her voice climbed higher. "You're harassing me! Someone help! This man is harassing me!" The words echoed down the street. The stillness that had surrounded them shattered further. A few distant voices murmured from somewhere nearby, residents inside the building or across the street drawn by the commotion. Lights flickered on in several apartments above. The sound of a window opening reached Jamal's ears, faint but distinct. On the second floor, an elderly figure leaned slightly out into the night. It was Mrs. Robinson. From her vantage point, she saw everything. She had watched it unfold in silence, her frail hands gripping the edges of her window frame. Her face, though partly shadowed, carried the unmistakable expression of someone who had seen this kind of thing far too many times. She shook her head slowly, her disapproval silent but piercing. Below, Linda's voice rose louder, her words frantic and accusatory. "He's following me. He's refusing to leave. Someone call the police. He's dangerous." Jamal turned his phone slightly to capture everything, her wild gestures, the exaggerated tone, the tension in her face. His own expression remained steady, though his frustration burned behind his eyes. "You're lying," he said firmly. "And you know you're lying. Just move out of the way." Linda didn't respond to him. Her gaze shifted briefly to the few people who had started to gather at the edges of the sidewalk. A man with a grocery bag paused mid-step, watching cautiously. Another woman, out walking her dog, glanced nervously at the scene and then turned to walk away, pretending she hadn't seen anything. No one intervened. Jamal's chest tightened. His voice dropped, quieter but sharper. "You're making a fool of yourself. Is this what you wanted?" Linda's voice faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. "I'm protecting my neighbors. If you don't belong here, then you're a threat." Jamal couldn't stop the hollow laugh that escaped him. "A threat? To who?" His phone remained steady in his hand. "I live here. I pay rent. I have every right to be here." After ingesting the fluid from the decaying patient's lips, Jamal come to stand before the two men. Linda hesitated, the weight of his words pressing against the flimsy wall of her excuses. But instead of backing down, she dug in further, her voice trembling now, not with fear, but with a stubborn refusal to admit she was wrong.
"I don't believe you," she said, quieter this time.
Jamal's face hardened, his tone flat and unrelenting. "You don't have to believe me. The truth doesn't need your approval." He turned and pointed at the doctor. "Approval!" From above, Mrs. Robinson shook her head again. She disappeared back into her apartment, the window creaking shut. Whatever she had seen would remain with her. Another quiet testament to a night that shouldn't have unfolded this way.
The crowd on the sidewalk grew slightly larger now, a handful of figures lingering at a distance. Some whispered among themselves. Others pulled out their own phones, recording quietly from the shadows. Linda noticed this. The phone screens catching her movements seemed to unnerve her. "Oh, Vic, thank you.
For the first time that night, her confidence flickered. Jamal stood his ground, his phone still recording, his voice cutting through the rising tension. "You should stop this before it gets worse," he said quietly. But Linda didn't move. Her pride wouldn't let her.
Linda's thumb hovered over the dial pad before pressing the digits that would summon the police. She raised the phone to her ear. Her voice was deliberate, clear, and loud enough for everyone to hear.
"Yes, hello," she began, her tone clipped and urgent. "There's a suspicious man outside my building. He's refusing to leave. He's aggressive, and I think he might be dangerous." Jamal didn't move. He didn't argue. Instead, he turned the phone toward himself, the red recording light steady and unwavering. His voice was calm, but the frustration in his eyes was impossible to miss. "This is what black men face every day," he said. The words hung there, carried by the steady hum of city life around them. Behind him, the door to the building stood open, the green light of his key fob a quiet reminder of the truth. That he belonged here. The cafeteria filled with people whose libs were masking their pain in the self-image they were trying to deceive. Linda continued her call. "Yes, I need someone here right away. He's refusing to show any ID and I don't feel safe." Jamal let out a slow breath, his patience running thin, but his resolve never wavering. He kept his phone raised, capturing every word, every gesture. He knew what this could become. He knew the stories too well. And so he waited. The moments stretched on like hours, Linda pacing a small circle with her dog at her side. Puffy barked again, pulling at the leash, but Linda ignored it, her attention fully on the phone call and her perceived victory. To her, the arrival of the police would confirm everything, that her judgment was right, that Jamal Carter did not belong. And then it happened. The sound of footsteps echoed from the building's lobby. The door opened further and a man emerged. Mike Johnson, a resident in his early 40s. Tall and broad-shouldered, Mike had a casual confidence about him, the kind that comes from familiarity. He carried a gym bag slung over his shoulder and wore earbuds that dangled loosely around his neck. Mike paused as he stepped outside, taking in the scene. He looked at Linda, who was still on the phone, and then at Jamal. A smile of recognition lit up his face as he turned toward Jamal. "Oh, hey, Jamal," Mike said casually, adjusting the strap on his bag. "You finally moved in, huh?" For the first time that night, Linda faltered. The words seemed to hit her like a cold splash of water, snapping her out of whatever conviction she had been holding on to. She blinked, turning toward Mike in confusion, her phone still pressed to her ear. Mike continued, completely unbothered by the tension in the air. "Man, you were talking about that move for weeks. Glad you're finally here. How's the place so far?" Jamal let out a breath, part relief, part exhaustion. He nodded toward Mike, his voice calm but firm. "It's good, man. I'm still settling in, but it's good." Linda's lips parted slightly, but no words came. The confident veneer she had worn for the past several minutes cracked ever so slightly. For the first time since the encounter began, she looked uncertain, her grip on the phone loosening. Mike glanced toward Linda now, finally registering her tension. His expression shifted slightly, confusion settling across his face. "Wait," he said, looking between the two of them. "What's going on here?" Jamal turned his phone back toward Linda, his tone sharper this time. "She called the police. She said I didn't belong here. Mike's eyebrows shot up, his head turned fully toward Linda, who now looked visibly flustered. The crowd at the edge of the sidewalk seemed to inch closer, the weight of the truth beginning to tip in Jamal's favor. Linda cleared her throat, her voice softer now but still defensive. I didn't know. I've never seen him before." Mike frowned, his tone flat and unimpressed. "He just moved in. You didn't need to do all this." In that moment, Linda's certainty cracked. She had built her accusation on nothing but a glance, on a belief she held without reason, and now the truth stared her in the face. Jamal's voice cut through the silence. "You didn't need to call anyone." Linda turned her gaze back to him, her face a mixture of guilt and stubbornness. She opened her mouth as if to respond, but the words never came. Mike shook his head slowly, muttering under his breath as he pulled his earbuds back over his ears. "This is ridiculous." Without another word, he walked off, leaving Linda and Jamal alone again. Jamal's phone remained steady, recording every moment. The screen glowed faintly in his hand, the truth immortalized in its frame. Linda, now cornered by the weight of her own actions, seemed smaller somehow, her earlier confidence stripped away. The quiet hum of the night was broken by the low wail of sirens. The blue and red flashes cut through the darkness, painting the apartment building in fractured light. The crowd of neighbors, now larger, stood scattered across the sidewalk and near the entrance. They whispered, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of their phones. Some recorded, others watched with quiet disapproval. Linda Thornton stood near the door, her small dog still tugging at its leash, unaware of the storms swirling around it. Her shoulders were squared, her expression smug. She had made the call, and now help was here. She turned to look toward Jamal Carter, still standing quietly by the entrance, his phone recording in his hand. Jamal hadn't moved much. He waited. 2 officers stepped out of the police cruiser, their presence commanding immediate attention. They were calm and professional, their hands resting near their belts, their gazes scanning the scene quickly. One officer, a tall middle-aged man with short-cropped hair, spoke first. "What seems to be the issue here?"
Linda was already moving before the words finished. She rushed to meet them, her voice high and urgent, the story pouring out of her in rehearsed certainty. "Officers, thank you for coming," she began, gesturing quickly toward Jamal. "This man doesn't live here. He's refusing to leave the building. I tried to stop him, but he pushed past me. He's acting suspicious. I'm worried for my safety."
The second officer, a younger woman with sharp eyes, tilted her head slightly as she observed Linda. The details were spoken too quickly, the pitch too rehearsed. Jamal remained where he was, his face calm but tired, the phone still steady in his grasp. "Sir," the first officer said, his tone neutral, "can you tell us what's going on here?"
Jamal nodded slightly, his voice calm but carrying the weight of his frustration. "I live here," he said simply, holding up the key fob in his hand. "I've told her that several times. I've shown her this. She still blocked me from going inside. I didn't do anything wrong." The officers exchanged a glance. Linda's voice cut in again, frantic now as she tried to wrest back control. "He's lying," she said quickly, her voice trembling with a forced righteousness. "I don't know him. I've lived here for 10 years. I know everyone in this building. He doesn't belong here." The younger officer held up her hand, silencing her. "Ma'am, we'll handle this." Jamal reached into his pocket slowly, every movement deliberate. He pulled out his wallet, flipping it open to reveal his ID. The light from his phone caught the reflective edge of the card as he held it out for the officers. If we were to assume that it was a PayPal dance card, we'd have a window. "I have my ID right here," he said, "and my address is listed. If that's not enough, I'm happy to show you my key fob working or my apartment lease, whatever you need." The officers leaned closer, the older one examining the ID briefly before nodding. The younger officer glanced back at Linda, her expression flattening slightly.
Your address matches the building, the older officer said, handing the ID back to Jamal. You live here.
Linda's face dropped. For the first time since the confrontation began, her confidence faltered completely. The color drained slightly from her cheeks, replaced by the growing realization of what was happening.
Can't be right, she said quietly, the words almost stumbling out of her mouth. I've never seen him before. The neighbors, some closer now, began murmuring, their voices soft, but sharp enough to cut through her protests.
11. She's doing it again. That's the third time this year.
What's her problem?
The sound of their voices rippled outward. The truth, so neatly hidden in Linda's own mind, had now begun to spill into the open.
Jamal tucked his ID back into his wallet. The younger officer looked back at him, her voice even and professional.
Sir, we appreciate your patience, she said. You're free to go inside. We're sorry for the inconvenience. Jamal nodded slightly, his face unreadable. He turned toward Linda briefly, the disappointment clear in his eyes. He didn't say anything. He didn't have to. The truth had already been spoken. I'd your might his own. And then Mike appeared again.
What's going on now? He asked, his tone edged with frustration. He glanced at Jamal, nodding slightly in greeting. Hey man, everything good?
Jamal exhaled slowly, shaking his head faintly. The officers turned toward Mike. Do you know this man? The older officer asked. Mike raised an eyebrow. Jamal? Yeah, of course I know him. He moved in a couple weeks ago. We talked the other day. What's all this about? I don't need to tell you. Linda flinched visibly. Her gaze darted between Mike and the officers, her earlier self-assurance fully unraveled now. Mike turned his attention to the officers, and then, pointedly, toward Linda. His voice dropped slightly, a mix of exasperation and disbelief.
She does this all the time, officers, he said. She thinks she owns the place. Every time someone new moves in, she's out here asking questions and starting trouble. It's embarrassing, honestly. The officers glanced at Linda, whose expression had turned to one of pure humiliation. Her mouth opened slightly, as though she wanted to respond, but the words didn't come. She looked smaller now, her shoulders hunched as she stared at the ground.
The neighbors watching from the sidewalk whispered again. Some shook their heads. Others didn't bother to hide their disapproval.
Linda had nothing left to say.
The officers offered Jamal a final nod before turning back to Linda. One officer spoke to her quietly, though his words were lost to the wind. The other neighbors, now fully aware of what had happened, began to disperse, some shaking their heads, others giving Jamal small nods of support as they passed.
Mike lingered near the entrance, waiting briefly as Jamal stepped inside. Don't let it get to you, man, he said quietly, his voice low but genuine. Some people never learn.
The night wasn't done yet.
Jamal turned back toward the door, unable to let it end so easily. His voice carried across the short distance, calm but unmistakably edged with frustration. You owe me an apology, he said. Linda's head snapped up. Her face was tight, as though the words stung her far more than they should have. Her grip on the leash tightened, her knuckles pale. I was only trying to keep the building safe, she shot back. The words came quickly, defensively, as if she needed them to justify her actions, not just to Jamal but to herself. You have no idea what kind of people come around here. I did nothing wrong. Speak. Jamal's eyes narrowed slightly, disbelief flashing across his face. You blocked me from my own home, he said, his tone firm. You called the police on me, you lied, and you still think you did nothing wrong? The woman's body was trembling. She said, Jamal did something wrong. Linda looked away briefly, the pressure of the truth beginning to push against her walls of denial. Around them, faint movement stirred. A figure appeared at the far edge of the lobby. It was Mrs. Robinson. The elderly woman moved slowly, one hand resting on the rail as she descended the stairs toward the entrance. By the time she reached the door, her presence could no longer be ignored. The neighbors still lingering outside turned toward her, whispering again, though their voices quieted as she stopped in front of Linda. For a moment, the two women faced each other, one holding the remnants of her broken certainty, the other holding decades of quiet wisdom. Mrs. Robinson's voice was calm, but it cut through the night like a blade. "Linda," she said, her tone heavy with disapproval, "this is shameful." Linda blinked, clearly startled by the words. Her mouth opened as if to protest, but Mrs. Robinson raised a hand, silencing her before she could speak. "You've embarrassed yourself," Mrs. Robinson continued, her voice rising slightly as her gaze locked on Linda, "and this whole community. You think you're protecting this building, but all you've done is shame it." The words hung there, firm and final. Linda stood frozen, her face pale and unreadable. Puffy barked softly, tugging at the leash as though trying to pull her away from the weight of the moment. From across the glass, Jamal watched quietly. His frustration softened, but it did not disappear. He lifted his phone one more time, turning the lens on himself as he spoke, his voice steady and measured. "This is why we record," Jamal said, the exhaustion plain in his voice. "For moments like this, so the truth comes out." The quiet of the evening deepened again. The truth had been spoken. Linda's actions would no longer exist as her version of events alone. Retraction. Round. Retraction. Retraction. The small crowd outside murmured softly, the words indistinct but heavy with meaning. Some shook their heads in disapproval. Others stared at Linda openly now, their patience with her long since worn thin. And then it happened. A young man near the back of the group spoke quietly, almost as though speaking to himself. "She did the same thing to my cousin last year," he said. Another neighbor turned toward him sharply. "Wait, she did that to you too?" The murmurs began to grow louder now. Other residents began speaking up. First one, then two, then more. "True stopped my nephew at the door once. Said he looked suspicious. She accused my sister of trespassing when she came to visit. She questioned my babysitter last month." The words carried a quiet momentum, rippling outward as the neighbors began piecing together stories they had kept to themselves until now. It wasn't just one incident. It wasn't just Jamal. Linda Thornton's name had become a stain on the building, her self-imposed role as its protector exposed for what it truly was. Linda's face fell further with each voice that spoke. Her shoulders slumped. The judgment she had so freely cast on others now surrounded her, her neighbors no longer willing to turn a blind eye. For years, Linda had built walls around herself, convinced that suspicion was the same as safety. But those walls could no longer hold. The truth she refused to see had become undeniable. And this time, it came from voices she couldn't silence. Jamal stepped back inside the building at last. The door clicked softly behind him, the sound final and resolute. He didn't look back as he disappeared into the lobby, leaving Linda alone with the weight of what she had done. Mrs. Robinson turned away as well, her job done. She walked back up the stairs at her own slow pace, her quiet dignity intact. Outside, Linda remained standing by the door, her neighbors still whispering, their eyes on her now in judgment, not respect. Her reputation, so carefully built, had begun to unravel thread by thread. She looked smaller now, her presence no longer commanding. Days passed, but the events of that night lingered like ripples in still water, spreading further than anyone could have expected. Jamal Carter, having recorded every moment of the encounter, uploaded the video online. It wasn't an act of vengeance, it was a decision born from necessity. The video was simple, it didn't need embellishments. There was no commentary, no captions, just raw footage of a man trying to enter his own home and being stopped, questioned, and accused. Jamal let the world see the truth as it happened. Within hours, the video gained traction. First, it was shared among small groups, friends, family, and those who knew this kind of story too well. Then it spread further, catching the attention of influencers, journalists, and news outlets. Millions watched as a petty accusation turned into an eye-opening moment, a quiet reminder of the battles many face every day, at their doorsteps, in their own homes, in lives they have every right to live. The responses came in waves. Comments filled the video, voices pouring out their support for Jamal and their anger at what had unfolded. Strangers wrote messages of solidarity, while others shared stories of their own experiences. Proof that Jamal's video was not an isolated incident, but part of a deeper truth. Headlines began to appear. News stations picked up the story. Man blocked from his own apartment building by suspicious neighbor. Caught on camera, accusations and assumptions spark outrage. And in each headline, Linda Thornton's actions were laid bare. Her face, frozen mid-argument in Jamal's video, became a symbol of bias, of judgment, of a kind of ignorance the world was no longer willing to ignore. At first, Linda tried to avoid it. She stayed inside her apartment, the curtains pulled tightly shut, her phone buzzing relentlessly with notifications she couldn't bring herself to read. But she couldn't escape what had been set in motion. The building's residents knew. Neighbors she had spoken to for years stopped meeting her eyes in the hallways. Conversations quieted when she entered a room. Small, polite nods disappeared entirely. For years, Linda had imagined herself as the unofficial protector of the building, a role she gave herself but no one else asked for. Now, her presence carried a different weight entirely. The woman who once controlled the doorways of her community found herself locked out. This time, by those who had watched her long enough to know the truth. Then came the letter. Building management sent a notice directly to Linda's apartment. It was formal, curt, and left no room for misinterpretation. This behavior is unacceptable and will not be tolerated. Any further incidents will result in additional action, up to and including termination of your lease. It was signed with the quiet authority of those tired of complaints, tired of stories, tired of Linda Thornton's unrequested watchfulness. For years, Linda had built walls of suspicion and control, but those walls had been torn down by the truth, and in their place stood the reality she had created for herself. And then there was the apology. Days after the video went viral, Linda issued a statement. It was short, too short to feel genuine, a half-hearted effort at redemption that did little more than confirm what everyone already knew. I deeply regret any misunderstanding that occurred. My only intention was to keep our building safe. The words fell flat. There was no acknowledgement of her actions, no admission of fault. Those who read it shook their heads, some laughed bitterly. The apology did not save her, it only solidified how little she had learned. In the building, Linda became a ghost. Neighbors passed her in silence, their gazes sharp with unspoken judgment. Conversations in the hallways continued without her. Small groups of residents gathered for coffee, for walks, for laughter, and Linda was never included. For Jamal, the days moved forward quietly. He returned to work, greeted familiar faces in the building, and settled fully into the life he had come here to create. Jamal refused to let the experience define him. He had faced the moment, captured it, and let it tell its own story. And in doing so, he gave a voice to truths too often left unheard. When asked about the video, about what happened that night, Jamal's response was simple. "It's not about me," he would say. "It's about what people choose to see. That's what needs to change." He never spoke Linda's name again. She didn't deserve the weight of it. For the building, life returned to its usual rhythm. Residents came and went, doors opened and closed, laughter echoed softly through the hallways. But something was different now. A shift in the way people looked at one another. A quiet acknowledgement of what had happened and what it meant. One evening, as the sun dipped low over the city's skyline, Jamal approached the entrance to his building again. The routine was the same as it had always been. A walk toward the door, the key fob ready in his hand. Yet, something had changed. He walked with confidence, his shoulders steady, his pace unhurried. The door before him was no longer a battleground, no longer a space where he had to prove his right to belong. It was his doorway, and it always had been. Mike appeared just as Jamal reached the door. He stepped out of the building, a gym bag over his shoulder, and flashed Jamal a grin. "Hey man," Mike said casually, "how's the new place treating you?" Changing." Jamal returned the nod, a small smile crossing his face. "It's good," he said simply. There was no tension this time, no stares, no suspicion. Jamal held up his key fob, the green light blinking quickly before the lock clicked open. He stepped through the door, his movements smooth and confident, uninterrupted, as they should have been all along. Sometimes standing your ground is the most powerful thing you can do. In the face of judgment, in the weight of assumptions, choosing to be seen for who you are and refusing to be less changes everything. If a story moved you, share it. If it opened your eyes, speak up. It starts with awareness, it grows with understanding, and it changes with action. Hit the like button, subscribe for more powerful stories, and drop a comment below. What would you do if you were in Jamal's shoes? Let's keep this conversation going. Together we can break down these walls, one truth at a time.